They said he had everything a man could want, a skyline folded into the palms of his hands, a name that opened doors and a fortune that seemed to breathe on its own. They said Murilo César Grimaldi owned the city's silence, that he priced the noise out of rooms with a glance. They were not entirely wrong. He had learned to answer a world that moved by contracts and numbers, to meet people in boardrooms where words were like chess pieces, and no one made unnecessary sound. Then one winter night, a car took the part of him that trusted the world. A streetlight, a phone call, a driver who mistook speed for certainty, and the headline, the sort that eats a man's privacy for breakfast, announced his new limit: sudden hearing loss. It was the kind of public wound that made gossip into legal tender. Cameras, condolence bouquets, lawyers sharpening their pens. Murilo let them have the noise and stepped into the one thing he knew how to do without words: watch. He could have chosen to be astonished, to let the loss teach him softness. Instead, he chose a weapon that matched his old life: calculation. Pretending to be deaf gave him a rare advantage. People, he reasoned, would lower their guard. They would speak as if the world were off stage. He would find the truth behind courtesies. So he sat, shoulders wrapped in wool, behind the broad desk that had seen more schemes than sunrise, and practiced silence the way some men practiced prayer. It was not noble. It was not even kind. It was, in his private accounting, necessary. The mansion heard nothing at first but his measured breathing. The staff whispered with the practiced caution of people around a fragile heirloom. Murilo's world narrowed to what he could see: the tilt of a jaw, the glint of a watch, the way hands claimed or yielded territory. Sound was a rumor. He told no one he would use this rumor as a net. The first person to cross it was a woman with flour under her fingernails and a laugh that would not respect a hush. Her name on the employment contract read Lydia de Souza, but the household called her Lydia, with the easy affection usually preserved for a favorite chair. She arrived carrying 2 paper bags of what she called essential mess, and a perpetually apologetic smile. Murilo watched from the paneled corridor while she filled the kitchen with the kind of disorder that smells like life: coffee grounds, orange peel, the faint tang of cinnamon. She kept talking as if it were possible to be punished for being silent. The house's hush pushed against her, and she pushed back. She spilled coffee on the entry mat within her first hour, cursed with a cadence both candid and theatrical. And then, because the staff's protocol forbade speaking to the employer directly when he'd been declared unhearing, she produced a small spiral notebook and a stubbled pencil. If the house had rules, she kept a parallel one. When you could not be heard, you said everything to paper. She scribbled and shoved the page toward the sitting room where Murilo sat under a blanket like some reluctant monarch. "Hi," the page read in a handwriting that leaned practical and wry. "I'm Lydia. I make a mean scrambled egg and I don't know billionaires. Son of a, this house is colder than a courthouse." Murilo had never seen a handwriting that made him smile before. He did not show it. He read the page with the same cool precision with which he read depositions. He let the words land in the private vault of his eyes. When she assumed he would not answer, she talked instead, out loud, as if the walls could translate honesty for her. Lydia's sentences were a bright, messy thread. Observations about the size of the silverware, a muttered critique of a portrait she decided looked like a man who did not like kisses, an aside about the child's toys that were decidedly too square for imagination. She said to no one, "If he's as cold as the tabloids say, I'll thaw him out with a spatula." Murilo heard that, because he was near enough, and because ears, like cameras, could betray intention. He did not move. He watched her flip through Teo's picture book with a childlike curiosity, and heard her change the voice for each animal, giving the giraffe a politician's accent and the mouse a conspiratorial whisper. He watched the way Teo, 4 years old, a small pulley of emotion, trusted the woman as if he had known her his whole life. There are ways of being seen that hurt less than being watched. Teo's trust was one of them. Murilo, who could not remember the last time someone offered him true, uncomplicated affection rather than strategic affection, felt a fault line open in his ribs. He closed his eyes for a second and practiced a silence that was finally honest. He was, in fact, listening. The early days were a series of small exclamations. Lydia left notes everywhere, and Murilo began a private library of them, a folded napkin by the child's plate that read, "He likes his toast like he likes negotiations, lightly scorched." A hastily written index card tucked under a stack of toy cars that said, "Teach me how to fix this blue one. It's got the look of a man pretending to be fine." She wrote about everything she couldn't say aloud, and sometimes more dangerously, about what she could. She said in the kitchen at midnight while stirring a pot of soup that smelled like the kind of home that did not belong in a marble mansion, "You're like a stern breeze, Mr. Grimaldi. Handsome, intimidating, probably smells like laundry detergent." She laughed at her own joke. She coughed then, not from propriety, but from the absurdity of whispering to a person she believed could not hear. And then she scribbled, "P.S. If you can read lips, please ignore that last thing." She placed the note where he would find it, certain he was blind to all but the necessary. Murilo, who could close the world like a ledger, kept the pages of her life like contraband. He compiled them inside a drawer meant for keys, the small confidences growing like a private vine. He had not planned for affection to be part of the intelligence he gathered. He had planned to catch a son's opportunist tutor explaining a trust fund's vulnerabilities, a secretary casually listing board members who could be bought, a brother revealing motives. What came instead in the first week was a soft accumulation of moments. Teo's sticky hand finding his beard and not flinching, Lydia rearranging the living room cushions into forts without asking, as if the furniture belonged to children more than to contracts, the muffled sound of Lydia singing about a poor, bewildered billionaire, and making the child clap. The staff called her a miracle. Maria, the head governess with years sharpened into patience, called her a storm that the household needed. Maria kept the diaries of the estate, schedules, lists, inventories, and she watched Murilo with the same polite skepticism that had always called him the boy who became a mountain. Now the mountain was learning charming things like how to be alarmed because a bowl of cereal had been eaten with a flower on top. Murilo's silence, however, was not a shield for feeling, at least not at first. It was an investigative procedure. He had boarded the city's sounds in the hope of finding truth. But truth, it turned out, arrived wrapped in the most mundane packages. The way Lydia stuck a Band-Aid on Teo's knee and lectured him on being less dramatic, the way she took off her shoes on the living room rug and left them beside the fireplace as if they had always belonged there. On the second Tuesday after Lydia's arrival, a small but unforgettable exchange happened in the nursery. Teo had constructed a fortress of blocks that leaned dangerously toward collapse. Lydia sat on the floor with him and read from a battered picture book, her knees sticky with do-it-yourself glue from a craft experiment gone exuberantly awry. "You know," she said into the room, loud enough for anyone within earshot, "I never had a palace, but I had a mother who could turn a cardboard box into a boat. This place could use more boats and fewer portraits." Teo frowned at the book, then at the portrait of Murilo that hung in the hallway, a painting that had always been too stern for daytime. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing. "Someone pretending to be asleep," Lydia answered, and then made a face, adding, "Or deaf." She grinned at the child, who didn't know better than to believe everything a grown-up said. Murilo, leaving the study where he'd been pretending to read a legal brief with no real interest in its contents, paused in the doorway. There he stood like an accusation in a room full of toys, watching Lydia place a stuffed rabbit into Teo's arms. The rabbit's ear flopped over, and the child giggled. If a man had the luxury of being honest with himself, Murilo's confession would have been brief. The laughter surprised him. It disarmed him, and against his plan, it started to teach him how to feel again. He could have left then and there. He could have returned to meetings and spreadsheet battlements. Instead, he stayed, and in staying he recorded the safe, whole sound of a woman who told the truth not out of spite, but out of the simple necessity of speech. It was a mercy to be inside such candidness. It was also dangerous. For Lydia's mouth, free as it was, carried information like a pocket flashlight, bright and blinding for whoever it landed on. She spoke of Murilo's secret obsessions, She joked, loud enough for any non-deaf observer, that she would not be surprised if Murilo hid a secret garden in the basement. She speculated, with the confidence of someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, about the household's fragility. "Money doesn't fix things," she would say. "It just gives people better ways to be lonely." Once, when she thought he truly could not hear, Lydia voiced something that steeped in the quiet more dangerously than any corporate memo. She stood at the doorway of the sitting room where Murilo liked to sit and spoke, hands on her hips, like a woman airing grievances in a market. "You don't have to be unreachable, Mr. Grimaldi," she declared. "You could be a person, you know. People make mistakes. They kiss too quickly. They leave the milk out. They get shouted at in supermarkets. People are a mess, and messy is honest." Murilo read the words she slid over the edge of his coffee table later that day. She'd written them down, and tucked the page under the newspaper as if she could archive courage. But the sound of her voice stayed in his chest the way an echo stays after the theater lights are dimmed. He could understand that she was, without intending to, unraveling him. It was not just that she was frank. It was that she had an affection for the human scale of life. Her jokes were not barbed, they were warm. She confessed once, while folding Teo's socks with the exaggerated deliberation of an artist, that she had ruined a boyfriend's ambition by saying what she thought of his shoes. "I said they were trying too hard," she told the room, and then crossed the line into something riskier. "I'd say it to you too, if I thought you'd listen." Murilo, who had built a life on the assumption that people listened for advantage, felt this as a kind of indictment. He had wanted to test loyalty, and instead he was being tested by the simplest of truths, that when someone spoke as if you were absent, they revealed themselves. He told himself he would remain unmoved. He told himself he was gathering data. He told himself many things that were true and many things that were lies. There is a slender difference between a man who watches people for evidence and a man who begins to watch them because he is falling. There were other, less tender observations. People drop their masks when they think their words will not ricochet back to them. At a weekly dinner held as an awkward show of solidarity, Murilo sat silent and allowed the orchestra of subtext to play. His brother Raphael, who possessed the same regal jawline but none of Murilo's restraint, seemed lighter in tone. He smiled as if he had discovered a toothpick in a cake and was eager to use it. Raphael had always been ambitious with an edge too sharp for family meals. Tonight, the edge had a plan. Raphael stood across from him in the room where Murilo had the habit of pretending ignorance like a coat he could put on when need required. He told a story to a small circle of trusted friends about managing a difficult market. He laughed about regulations and slipped a comment into his narrative, an offhand remark that would have seemed only ill-placed to a man who could hear the entire orchestra. "All it takes," Raphael said, leaning forward with the conspiratorial glint that always made Murilo's spine tighten, "is a well-timed acquisition and the right board vote. When the chairman disappears, people begin to look for a captain. Captaincy is an expensive idea to buy." Murilo, who had been reading a document with the feigned helplessness of someone whose world had been muffled, felt something like ice in his throat. He had positioned himself to overhear triviality and received instead the architecture of a threat. He could not act on suspicion. That was the rule. Suspicion required proof. Proof required the kind of sound that could be recorded or repeated by witnesses. He had only one advantage: the way people throw caution into a room when they think it is empty of hearing. 2 nights later, on a night when rain insisted on cleansing the city like an unforgiving editor, Murilo found the door to his private library ajar. He had not left it so. From the corridor he could see the white glow of a phone on speaker, the blue light like a make-believe moon. A man's voice, low, confident, floated into the hallway. It was Raphael, and he had forgotten to modulate his tone for a man pretending not to listen. "Stage 1, Raphael was saying, voice small and sharp like a scalpel, "is to secure the committee. We push a narrative, safety concerns. The board will vote in an emergency. People will sign because they fear litigation. We move funds to a shell company. The donors can be convinced. The projections will be doctored. Across the room, someone chuckled into the line. A corporate shark who smelled of O-negative and opportunism. Murilo could not make out every syllable, but the parts he heard were enough to infect his bones. The plan was not an accidental strategy. It was a design. It named people in whispers and assigned a map to take his name. He watched Raphael step away from the phone in a way that meant he thought the house was full of the illusion of safety. That behind each polished surface, the man he wanted to depose was no longer a danger. Murilo pressed his fingers to the doorframe and felt the pulse of a man who had miscalculated. He was not omniscient. He had not conjured a scheme out of thin air. He had simply opened his ears and found that a brother's ambition had teeth. At that moment, the house was too loud and too quiet all at once. It was the sound of a plan forming and the sound of a heart learning it could break. Murilo let the sentence hang in the air, a dangerous comet that would not be extinguished. He thought then, with a clarity that shocked him, about the steadiness of Lydia's hands and the careless way she talked about love, as if it were a simple, fixable thing. He thought about Teo's trust, about Maria's eyes when she measured loyalty, about the parents who had left months ago and had been spoken of in the house like a myth people pretended to believe. For the first time since the accident, Murilo's silence felt like a liability rather than a shield. He had made the house a theater to catch false plays, and had instead gathered the raw, living chorus of people whose voices mattered. He had supposed the world would become more intelligible without sound. Instead, it had become more treacherous. Still, he could not move. He was not ready to reveal that he heard. Not yet. The reveal would require orchestration, a counterpoint to deception with truth. It would require catching not just the words, but the actors behind them. If Raphael truly intended what Murilo had heard, then exposing him would not merely be a private pleasure. It would be a defense. He slipped back into the shadow of the doorway, pretending once more to be a man who could not be disturbed by the clatter of treason. He let the conversation play out, registering phrases that would later be juxtaposed against receipts and travel logs, and the small telltale things men leave when they plan to take a name. The night made a ledger. Dates, suggestions, a list of outsiders who had been promised positions in exchange for votes. Raphael spoke of numbers with the easy cruelty of someone speaking of cattle. By Q3, he said, we stage a liquidity crisis. People panic. We offer a patch, and the patch happens to come from hands I manage. We'll steer the assets into a trust, and by then, this will be irreversible. Murilo tasted metal in his mouth. Not from the words themselves, but from the certainty that family could be weaponized like a ledger entry. He had once thought himself immune to betrayal. That was arrogance. He had once thought the world owed him loyalty because he gave it orders. That was hubris. Now the ledger was balancing against him. The next morning, Murilo walked into the breakfast room, a man who had gathered a small winter's worth of fury like a scarf. Lydia was at the table, humming to herself and arranging Teo's cereal with the seriousness of an artist. She had written him a card, small and unapologetic, that said, "Did you know? He snores like a chainsaw. Kidding. Maybe." She tucked it under his newspaper. He did not glance at it. Instead, he watched her from the edge of the room while she told Teo a story about a brave mouse who lived in the pocket of a sailor's coat. She made funny voices, and the child laughed the way light laughs, without capacity for irony. Murilo wanted to be a part of that light. He also wanted to catch a brother and keep his name from being stolen. Murilo's plan broadened the way water widens a desperate crack. He would gather evidence. He would test loyalty. He would figure out which of his extended household, those who had eyes only for the ledger and those who held a child's hand like it was currency, would fold when opportunity presented itself. The deafness he wore was no longer solely a mask. It had become an experiment in human truth. He was, however, aware of a risk he had not counted on, that the experiment might change him. The more he listened to Lydia's offhand honesty, the way she swore she would be honest if given the chance, the way she scrawled, "In a hurry, I think I'm falling," the more he recognized that not all truth was evidence to be used. Some of it was a small, dangerous promise. So he listened. He learned the timetable of her confessions. He cataloged them like pearls, each small admission about her past that made her an easier person to love. Abandoned college ambitions, a daughter-like attachment to a neighbor's terracotta garden, hands that spoke affection in ways words did not. He filed them in a drawer against a future that he was not sure he wanted to have. When Lydia found a moment to sit with him, she did not know she was looking at a man who could hear. She did not understand the way her words folded into him. She believed him incapable of the most intimate of betrayals, eavesdropping, and for that she was clownishly generous with herself. She would sometimes leave a note on his pillow, found a sock in the chandelier. Also, you are no mustache away from being a romantic cliché. And she would laugh till her cheeks hurt. Murilo read everything, and let the small human jokes land like soft bombs inside his chest. There is a humbling arithmetic in falling. You lose some heights, you gain some depths. Murilo had always measured people by how useful they were, by how profitably they fit into an equation. Lydia's uselessness, her messy warmth, her propensity to plant basil in the windowsill where it choked under neglect, did something he had not budgeted for. It softened numbers. A week after the phone call that had named a plan, Murilo found another note from Lydia, where she confessed, in the blunt way she had, that she liked him. Not the polite, perfunctory like of a colleague, but the dangerous, messy like of someone who knew that liking could require a downgrade of the safe life. I know you don't want to be loud, the note read, but if you were me, I'd be loud about all the wrong things and right ones too. He carried the note to the study and placed it inside the drawer, that now had two secret lives, one for corporate evidence, one for the unnerving softness of a woman's handwriting. For a man who had cultivated silence, these pages sounded like rebellion. The morning after he heard Raphael's plan, he walked through the house and noticed things in a new light. The rugs seemed less like ornaments, and more like islands where life could occur. The portraits looked less like sentries and more like men who had given their faces to the past. He began, for the first time, to count allies by warmth rather than convenience. Still, he hesitated. To end the act would be to reveal himself and risk the immediate collapse of the test. To continue was to risk losing Lydia in the slow economy of deceit. He was a man caught between a ledger and a laugh. That evening, as rain drew thin rivers down the windows, Raphael visited with the easy arrogance of one who believed rules bend for his smile. He greeted Murilo with a kiss on the cheek that had more calculation than affection. Murilo noticed the scent of Raphael's cologne, wood and success, and how naturally his brother used intimacy as a lever. Over dinner, Raphael spoke in the kind of nonchalant register designed to be overheard. He made small jokes about succession and resilience. He spoke of donors and committees and the way crises were managed. Murilo kept his face a mask of polite vacancy. He placed fork to lips as if taste had become a distant possibility. When Raphael excused himself to take a call, he believed the house silent. He stepped into the library and lowered his voice. Murilo, sitting at the edge of civility in the next room, felt the geometry tighten. He heard phrases like board vote and liquidity window that were concrete enough to become strategy. He heard allies named, plans laid out, the kind of arithmetic that made empires rearrange like cards. And in the middle of the conversation, Raphael, easing into the dangerous assumption that Murilo could not hear, said something that reverberated against Murilo's carefully balanced moral ledger. "We're family," Raphael said into the phone, a twisted attempt at closeness. "But sometimes family is business." The phrase landed like a fist. Murilo understood then, in a way the accident could not teach him, that the house's silence had created a vacuum that cruel ambition was filling. He had overseen boardrooms that used language for camouflage. He now watched his brother perform the same trick, at the level of kinship. It made the betrayal sharper. After the call ended, Raphael returned as if nothing had happened. He clapped Murilo on the shoulder with the kind of force that suggested a man who had given his hand to the task of taking. They ate the rest of the meal under a tapestry of unspoken things. That night, alone in the study, Murilo touched the drawer where he had kept Lydia's notes and the evidence he had begun to collect. He imagined them pressed into a book, each page a small but unignorable truth. He thought of the child sleeping down the hall with a toy in his hand, and the way a child's trust seemed to belong to another economy than the one Raphael trafficked in. He closed his eyes and measured his next move with the neatness of a man who had long made decisions by spreadsheet. He would not expose Raphael without proof. He would not confess his hearing until he had built a case. And he would, if he could, protect anything, anyone in the house from being used as a bargaining chip. Of all the calculations, one remained the hardest. What to do about the woman who had said she was falling? She had said it like a dare and like a plea. She had left the sentence in ink in the corner of his life, like a flag planted in unfamiliar soil. Murilo stood, fingers splayed on the lacquered wood of his desk, and listened to the rain. The city outside had no mercy for secrets. Inside the house, the silence he wore began to crack, not because he had been discovered, but because he had discovered something in the silence. That hearing is not merely a physical act, it is an ethical one. To hear a betrayal is to be obliged to stop it. To hear a confession is to be obliged perhaps to answer it. He stayed silent because being seen would force a kind of reckoning he was not yet prepared to face. But he did not stay frozen. He could not. A plan formed, one that would give him proof, shield the child, and, in some corner, allow him to keep the woman whose laughter had begun to breach his defenses. That plan would require patience, evidence, and the most dangerous thing of all, trust. He had pretended to be deaf to test loyalty, and in doing so he had lured more than disloyalty into his net. He had lured truth, messy and warm, and a brother with teeth. Outside the house, the rain turned the city into a smear of headlights and rumor. Inside, a child shifted in his sleep, and the house kept breathing. Murilo bowed his head for a moment as if the act of listening required at least a token of contrition. He had heard what he shouldn't. He could feel the weight of that sound gathering into consequences. But for now, he would do the only thing he knew how to do well. He would record, he would observe, and he would wait until the truth laid itself out in the margins. If you like stories that pull at the seams of power and reveal something human underneath, subscribe. You'll be here when the walls finally speak. Days passed like that. Small domestic wars, votes of confidence in the nursery, whispered corporate maneuvers folded into the margins. Lydia continued her noisy ministry of repair. Murilo continued his cold calculus with a warmth he would neither admit nor acknowledge. He watched the way she doodled tiny suns on the margins of the grocery list, and how she tucked those lists into corners where he would find them. Then came the morning that shifted the axis. Murilo was in his study, pretending to mark a file with all the disinterest of a bored accountant, when he heard laughter in the garden. It was Raphael's laugh, easy and oily. It was followed by another voice, someone Murilo recognized as a consultant who had, not long ago, begged to sit at the table. Murilo slipped along the wall like a shadow on a spring day and peered through the blinds. They were outside near the conservatory where the roses clung to their trellis as if to a memory. The men thought the house's heart was muted and safe. They were wrong. "I tell you," Raphael was saying, the sunlight making his teeth look brighter than his morals. "Murilo's accident is an opportunity. People will rush to help us. They'll see weakness and they'll offer solutions. Our job is to make sure the right hands hold the patch." The consultant, whose name Murilo did not bother to learn until necessity made it practical, nodded, his smile professional and cold. "We'll build a shell. We'll control the narrative. We'll stroke the media. People are gullible in sympathy." Murilo leaned on the window frame until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to walk out and break recognition across Raphael's smile. He wanted to take the payroll and the board minutes and the carefully arranged dinner conversations and fling them like cards into the air so everyone could see whose hand was gambling. But then Lydia came into the garden carrying a basket of laundry with one sock hanging from her mouth like a pirate's flag. She did not see the men at first because she had the habit of seeing the day as she wished to make it. "Morning," she said, loud and unabashed. "Who's busy scheming today?" Raphael started, and for a fraction of a second his face assumed a shade Murilo had never seen before. A domestic surprise. He smiled too quickly, like a man flushing at being called out. The consultant chuckled and adjusted his collar. Lydia trailed her eyes over the men, and then, oblivious to the gravity of the moment and intent solely on the laundry, she did something she had done before. She began to tell Murilo, whom she thought deaf, the truth of how she felt about him. "You are an untidy mystery," she said to the house like it was a person with pockets. "You scowl like somebody invented chaos and you're taking it personally. I don't know what you do when you aren't asleep on the couch, but if I had to guess, you probably saved lives with spreadsheets." Raphael, recovered, said something light to the consultant. Lydia, in the middle of folding a shirt that still had a sticker on its sleeve, put her hands on her hips and continued. And she said with a candor that would have been indecent anywhere but here, "I think I like you. There, I said it. It feels like dropping a vase in a quiet house. Sorry." The sound of the admission hung in the garden like a bell that had been rung too softly to be polite. Murilo felt the world pivot. It was not the business risk that stabbed him so much as the small, revealed fact that someone could be that brave in the margins of his life. He had heard confessions meant for no ears at all. He had heard the tender, ridiculous sound of a woman admitting her heart. He had heard, too, the soft bargaining of men who would exchange kinship for control. He had heard what he shouldn't. Raphael went inside after a beat, his stride measured, his smile unreadable. The consultant followed, and the garden returned to the cadence of birds righting themselves. Lydia folded one last sock, then looked up as if feeling the house breathe. She slapped her palms together with the satisfaction of someone who had finished a task and tossed the basket toward the laundry room. Teo came running, and she scooped him, pressing a kiss on his forehead the way one might stamp a small, permanent approval. Murilo watched, and in that watching, discovered a new kind of cruel possibility. That by pretending he had been lame to sound, he had not only caught treachery but had also ensnared a heart. He closed the blinds so the glass would not betray him, and the room filled with a private darkness. Outside, the city continued its small, indifferent business. Inside, his house had become a place where loyalty and betrayal were being arranged like chess pieces. He placed his palm against the cool glass of the window and felt, for the first time, the slightest tremor of something that might be called fear. Not the fear of losing money, he had never been unafraid of that, but the fear of losing something less quantifiable, a child's laugh, a woman's candid honesty, a chance at living instead of calculating. Murilo opened his desk drawer and took out the pages of evidence he had begun to assemble. He compared dates and phrases, matching them to the conversations he had heard in the night. He scribbled a list and then crossed out the word revenge. It was not revenge he wanted. It was protection. Still, the knowledge that his brother's hand hovered over his empire like a claimant's palm filled him with a dangerous, I-could-do-anything feeling. The deafness had become an instrument, and instruments could be misused. He told himself he would keep pretending. He told himself the reveal would be surgical, merciful, and precise. He did not tell himself about Lydia's note that said in no uncertain terms, "If you wake up from this act, don't make me regret loving you." That single line made him both more methodical and more treacherous. It made his choices harder to justify. It made the house a sort of moral battleground where the currency was truth and the coin minting was messy and human. He placed the note back among the others and steadied his breathing. Outside the glass, rain had stopped. The neighbor's dog barked like a polite alarm. Inside, a child started to sing a half-forgotten song. Murilo did not yet know how to be the man Lydia believed he could be. But he was beginning. He was beginning to understand what it meant to be noticed for reasons other than profit or posture. The knowledge settled in him like a lesson learned too late. Habits of a lifetime do not dissolve because a man chooses to listen. Over the following days he moved with a new, almost surgical patience. He did not storm into confrontations. He did not make threats. He collected, quietly and methodically, the evidence a board and a court would require. His hearing had given him names and phrases. His mind turned them into leads. He instructed Maria to make informal inventories when Raphael was present. He asked his long-trusted security chief to keep a log of unusual visitors, and to archive CCTV clips from the conservatory and the library. He authorized, through counsel, a discreet audit of recent transfers. Nothing immediate would be concrete without paper, but paper could be coaxed into aligning with what he had already heard. He relied on people who still believed in the house as a place that could contain and protect a child. Maria, with her ledgered patience, became his confederate. She did not like secrets any more than she liked cold porridge, but she understood loyalty as a currency and accepted the cost. The household staff were not unaware that something tense moved across the marble floors. They only misread its shape when they thought it was grief, but Maria read it for what it was: vigilance. Between the preparations and the legal work, there were moments that had nothing to do with power. Those were often the ones that cut him worst. Teo learned to bring him drawings, monsters with big hearts and rockets with wheels, and to place them on the desk as if they were legitimate proposals. Murilo kept those sketches beneath the pile of paper where he tracked dates and phone logs. At dusk he would open that drawer and look at crude suns and crooked houses, and his ledger would soften into gratitude. Lydia continued to write. She had an instinctive faith in the written word. If speech could be misunderstood or weaponized, ink was tiny resistance. She left notes on the refrigerator saying things like, "Don't be a statue today," and slipped index cards into book pages with recipes and one-liners. She did not know about the files in his drawer. She thought she was scribbling for the house and for the child, and sometimes for the man she believed would never answer her aloud. Some days Murilo would place her notes in his pocket and walk to the study to read them alone, the way a man used to holding other people's trust might read scripture. He cataloged confessions along with corporate observations, always careful to keep the two separate in his head. She had volunteer warmth, the rest were calculations. Yet there was a growing danger to this practice. The thing he intended to protect by remaining unreadable was changing him into someone who hoarded moments like contraband. Raphael, meanwhile, did not wait. The kind of man who believes he has been handed fate for polishing will always move early. With a few loyal allies in finance and a consultant who could charm a signature, Raphael began to accelerate the timetable Murilo had heard. He scripted a contingency plan, an emergency meeting, a whispered suggestion to the board that leadership continuity required an interim chairman, a rumor about regulatory scrutiny that would make any investor nervous. The plan that had sounded coy in a library at night was taking form in emails and signed drafts. Murilo watched the pieces fall like dominoes that were expected to topple a legacy. The first outward move came with a press release. At the family's request, Mr. Grimaldi will refrain from public appearances while undergoing medical evaluation. The wording was a polite umbrella for the narrative Raphael needed. Clarification of incapacity leading to responsible interim management. The stock dipped politely, and the sympathetic op-eds appeared in the right pages. Murilo read them with the peculiar distance of a man watching a reputation arrange itself like a prop on a stage. He had in counsel a lawyer who owed him more than professional debt. They had once been classmates, and their friendship had been built on mutual respect, not convenience. Adrian volunteered to orchestrate the legal endgame quietly. He traced money trails, issued subpoenas where necessary, and began to assemble a public case that would not rely on Murilo's testimony alone. The advantage of Adrian's approach was that it translated overheard talk into the kind of hard proof a corporate board could not ignore. Transaction records, shell company registrations, meeting minutes with suspicious attachments. Murilo watched it all but did not speak. He let the legal process move like a tide. All the while, Lydia lived as she always did, brusquely tender, utterly uncalculated. She taught Teo to make paper boats. She sang off-key while folding laundry. She left a half-eaten cookie on his side table with a card that said, "For when you need something small and morally certain." Once she wrote, "If love were a filing cabinet, mine would be messed up and stubborn," and taped it to his lamp. On the day Adrian called to say he had enough to summon a board vote, Murilo felt the hush in his chest expand into a decision. They would call a meeting and present the evidence. The company's bylaws allowed for emergency action if there was proof of impropriety. Raphael could be confronted with paper that matched his voice to deeds. The ethical work was simple: present, expose, depose. It should have been a clean move by the ledger's standards. But human equations rarely sum that neatly. The night before the board convened, Lydia left a card under his teacup. It said in her quick, slanted script, "Morning, if you are awake, you should smile. If you can't smile, you should at least frown in a way that means later you laughed about it." She tucked it in without making a show. Murilo found it with the kind of reverence he reserved for small truths. He did not tell her he would be taking the stage the next morning. He would reveal himself at the exact moment the board needed to see the man they thought vulnerable. The reveal would be his instrument to break the conspiracy and reclaim what belonged to a boy who had no other guardian. At 9 the next morning, the boardroom filled with men and women in fabrics that tolerated pressure. Cameras were politely present. The meeting was both a legal necessity and a public event. Raphael moved through the room with ease, smiling as if his brother's silence had finally given him the space he'd always coveted. Murilo sat in the chair at the head of the table, wrapped in the theater of muteness. He had rehearsed nothing aloud because he feared the tremor in his own voice. He had rehearsed everything in private and in paper. His pulse had a rhythm that did not read as anxiety because this was the life he'd practiced. Control. Adrian stood and presented the evidence. He spoke with the calm efficiency of an advocate. Shell companies tied to Raphael's confidants, wire transfers executed in small, less noticeable amounts, documentation of meetings scheduled to coincide with Murilo's absence. He did not dramatize, he did not need to. Paper is a reliable dramatist. There was a murmur, then a ripple of denial, the kind men make when their world is rearranged without their consent. Raphael's face hardened into that expression of practiced hurt. He reached for a defense that had always served him, charm softened by the hint of wounded affection. "This is," he began, ready for 1,000 familiar lines of plausible error. Murilo stood then, slowly, deliberately, the motion small enough to seem like an itch and large enough to be an impression. The room drew a breath as if someone had pulled the blinds and let a sliver of sunlight in. He did not clear his throat. A few in the room, particularly those outside the house's intimate orbit, had believed the rumor. For them, the man across the table was a question mark. When he spoke, his voice was, at first, an odd thing to hear, a low, steady instrument that few of the people around him had ever heard. It was not theatrical. It was not meant to be. It simply belonged to the man who had been living inside the hush and finally chose to answer. "Adrian's paper is accurate," he said. "Raphael has been organizing a transfer of company assets. I've heard the plans. I've been unable to act because I preferred to learn rather than accuse. That mistake is over." Raphael's expression flickered into disbelief and then outrage. "You," he started, but his voice hit the air without the usual deference. His allies looked between the two brothers like people trying to read a map in unfamiliar language. Murilo did not gloat. He laid out dates, times, and corresponding evidence. A meeting that matched the conservatory conversation, bank transfers that matched amounts mentioned, a consultant's invoice that lined with the names Adrian had subpoenaed. The room had the sudden, slow recognition of men watching a ledger balance itself against guilt. "You used me as a way into the company," Raphael said, flinging the accusation like a blade. "You staged this, your illness, to trap me. Family should not be treated like a case study." The accusation landed and echoed with a logic Murilo recognized but refused to accept. He turned to the family ledger inside his chest and found a new kind of honesty. "I pretended I could not hear to see who would speak truth when they thought no one listened," he said. "That choice, cruel as it may have been, came from the only instinct I trusted, to protect my son and this house. If that makes me a study, then I accept it. But I will not accept someone using our name for profit." The board voted. Men and women who had sat sheltered by plausible deniability now had to choose. The motion to suspend Raphael and open a criminal investigation passed with a margin that made the chairman's jaw loosen. Cameras recorded the decision. The market would digest the news later. For now, the house acted like a ship deciding to change course. On the way out of the building, Raphael did not speak to his brother. He left with the kind of swagger men use when they believe a setback can be weaponized into future advantage. Outside, reporters jostled for statements, and the news cycle warmed like a small fever. The footage of Murilo's voice, the first time many had heard it in public, was clipped and replayed on morning shows. The calmness, the accusation, the quiet gravity of a man who had learned to act. A headline called him the silent titan who spoke. Another anointed him the quiet architect of justice. Somewhere in between, the story of family betrayal and corporate greed found its place in the day's appetite. Lydia saw the clip as the board news made its rounds on her phone. She had not been invited to the meeting. Of course not. Nor had she been told of the legal maneuvering. For her, words meant proximity. She dropped a dish with a small, audible clatter and frowned at the screen. She carried Teo in one arm and the child's backpack in another, her hair a little mussed from the morning's hurry. When the camera showed Murilo standing, when the cameras heard his voice, she felt the ground rearrange. She had written her confessions like offerings to a man she thought did not listen. Now that he had spoken, publicly and with conviction, she found herself thinking the worst, that her private admissions, her jokes, her admissions of liking him, even the single line about falling could be used as theater. That he had known and not told her felt like theft. Maybe she had misjudged the smallest rule of the house. If you speak to the deaf, you are safe. If you speak to the pretending, you are a mark. She did not go to the house that afternoon. Instead, she slipped into the old apartment of a friend and sat on a sagging couch with a cup of tea gone cold. The city outside went on with indifferent noise. Inside, her chest was crowded with the kind of shame that had a sharp personal geometry. Her mind assembled images. Murilo, not the silent puzzle she had loved to tease, but a man who could hear the things meant to be private and who had used them in public. Her fingers found a note card in her apron pocket, the one where she had written, shyly, "I think I'm falling." She folded it like a secret and then, with a small, sudden motion, wadded it into a ball and tossed it into the trash. News vans at the Grimaldi estate had the appetite of scavengers. Maria had to fend off requests from friends and neighbors for comment. The house hummed with a strain of attention it had not seen since the accident. The atmosphere thickened into something both vindicating and dangerous. Vindicating because the threat had been exposed. Dangerous because the means, his masquerade, felt to many like a moral misstep. Lydia's absence did not go unnoticed. Teo asked for her at dinner, and Murilo felt the child's question like a physical ache. He had intended to be careful with Lydia. He had not intended to weaponize her silence. When Maria told him she could not find her that afternoon, the moment became a new calculus. He had caught an enemy. He had also inadvertently hurt someone he might care for. He found her at dusk, the first empty light of evening softening the city's edges. She was on the stoop of a small church she liked for its honesty and for the way the fountain allowed children to turn stones into islands. Lydia had a scarf wrapped like an afterthought around her neck, and she sat with her head lowered, hands gripping a paper cup that steamed into the closing day. Murilo stood some distance away at first, as if the etiquette of contrition required him to allow her space. She looked up when she heard his step, and did not offer him the casual card she often did. Her eyes were guarded, her mouth pressed into a line that asked more questions than it answered. "You lied," she said without ceremony. The sentence could have been softer, could have been framed as an inquiry, but it had bluntness in it, the bluntness of someone used to speaking quickly and expecting truth. He felt the old instinct to defend himself rise. Instead, he chose what frightened him more: honesty. He knelt on the low wall near her and met her eyes. The movement was as intimate as a confession. "I did," he said. "I'm sorry. I told myself it was the only way to protect what mattered." She made a small laugh that was half split with frustration. "Protect? You turned everything private into a test. You let me be fearless around what I thought was a broken man. I told you things because I believed you couldn't be hurt by them, or use them." "You believed the wrong thing," he answered. "And I made a wrong choice." Lydia's hands fluttered toward the trash can at her feet. She pulled a tiny wadded paper out and unfolded it with a tenderness that was almost ceremonial. It was the crumpled card she had once tucked in her apron, the one that said, "I think I'm falling." Her fingers smoothed the paper the way one might try to iron out a memory. "How many things did you hear?" she asked. It was not an accusation so much as a request for the scope of damage. "Enough," he said. "Enough to know there was a plan, enough to stop it, not enough to justify the way I did it." Silence arrived, wide as the sky between them. Teo's laughter drifted from across the square, a bright, careless sound. Murilo felt that laughter as a tether he could not underestimate. "I was afraid," he said, "of losing this, of losing him, of losing the life I had." He swallowed. "But that fear did not give me the right to take your words and keep them for a test. I should have trusted the people who cared without needing to trap them." Lydia's face was a study in contradiction. Anger and something like sympathy wedged together. She stood then, not to flee but to put distance like a measure. "You used my heart like an experiment," she said. "People use that, and then everything becomes a ledger to them. I don't want to be an item." "You're not an item," he said. He stretched his hand out awkwardly, not daring to bridge the physical. "Show me how to make amends." She laughed, incredulous and not unkind. "You don't get to write a spreadsheet titled How to Apologize. You either mean it or you don't." "I mean it," he said simply. She let him believe for a long moment, then walked away, not like a person who was wholly gone, but like someone who had amended the distance between them into a road she might or might not choose to travel. He watched her go with an ache that felt honest for the first time. She had not said yes, she had not even said when or if. She had simply left some measure in the air that required work. Murilo returned to the house to manage the aftermath. Statements, reassurances to stakeholders, and, at some level, to prepare for the possibility that Lydia might not come back. He had saved the company from a corporate coup. He had also perhaps saved the family from public desecration of its name. Yet the way he had achieved it left a bruise. He knew he must not pretend it would be fixed quickly. Meanwhile, Raphael's next moves were a mixture of legal countermoves and petty malice. He retained counsel and filed for an internal review of the procedure, raising questions about the ethics of Murilo's disclosures. The press smelled drama, and Raphael did not hesitate to supply it. He painted himself in interviews as a guardian of the company history, a man who had never wanted to be Mr. Grimaldi's adversary. It was the kind of rhetoric that even guilty men can craft with skill. But this particular story was not merely a contest of public relations. This was also a family ruptured and potentially reassembled. Murilo's parents, whose distance had been a slow, complicated thing, arrived the day after the board vote. They had followed the headlines with the kind of private worry that reopens old hurts. His mother looked smaller than he recalled, her face softened by time and regret. His father was a man with a posture that had once kept all things in line, but now seemed to carry the weight of lost conversations. Their arrival created in the house a pressure both terrible and hopeful. Old grievances hovered, the reasons they had walked away months before, the unspoken words that had become their habit. Murilo had not expected them, he had not sent for them. But once they stood in the foyer, Maria's eyes watering with the small, private joy she did not always allow herself, he realized their presence could change the tone of everything. Seeing them unsettled the ledger he had kept with such dedication. At dinner that night, the three Grimaldis sat at the large table, the son, the estranged parents, and a house that had borne witness to both. Conversation started stilted and then loosened when his mother asked about Teo, and when his father, clumsy with affection, complimented a chair he once had designed. They spoke like people who practiced distance until it became reflex. Murilo felt the old landscape rearrange into something softer when his mother reached across and touched his hand. Not in accusation, but in a gesture that suggested the possibility of care. The presence of the parents altered Raphael's posture too. He was quick to public gestures of reconciliatory family concern, invitations for private meetings that smelled like truce. For the first time, he had to operate in front of witnesses who did not take his smiling claims at face value. That was a small, useful complication. The weeks that followed were heavy with consequence. The company's investigation confirmed the pattern Adrian had suspected. Regulatory agencies opened formal inquiries into the transfers. Raphael was removed from his executive role, and later compelled into a settlement that included a divestment and a public apology that read less like repentance and more like a necessity. The world, hungry for simplicity, called the situation a family drama, and moved on to the next irresistible headline. The household, however, had to reconstruct trust. Lydia did not return to the Grimaldi mansion immediately. She took time, 2 weeks, then a month, to decide whether the person who had kept her truth was worth staying in proximity to. She found herself walking the city at dusk, visiting the little bakery where she had once worked and letting acquaintances ask, gently, whether she was all right. People said sympathetic things. The presence of sympathy is sometimes a test in itself. She watched Murilo from a distance at first. News clips, the occasional photograph, not daring to look at him in the pages because proximity felt risky. One evening, months after the first boardroom confrontation, she received a note. It was not the kind of state-structured memo she had begun to fear. It was a card tucked under a cafe cup where she met a neighbor. On the card he had written simply, in the same quick hand he had adopted for his private notations, "There is a small exhibition of Teo's drawings at the community center tomorrow. If you want to come, I'll be there. M." She folded the card and read it twice. It was not a command. It was a small invitation that acknowledged her autonomy. She went. At the community center, Teo had a wall of drawings pinned up like a constellation of half-understood ideas. He ran to her and showed her every rocket, every dinosaur, insisting she help him arrange them. Murilo arrived quietly, not making a show of himself, and stood near the back. He did not speak for a while. He watched Lydia interact with the child with the kind of distance a man learns to keep when he is earnestly trying not to frighten something he wants to protect. Afterwards, while the child dragged a ribbon of paper across a table, Murilo found her sitting on a bench outside, the sky quiet and tender. He walked toward her with that deliberate, cautious step, the one that said he had learned to move without breaking. "You could have stayed away," she said the moment they were alone. It was not a perfect opening, but it was honest. "I couldn't," he said, "not after seeing the drawings framed. Not after Teo asked where his fairy cape had gone and I realized I had no defense for the things I'd used to raise walls." She watched him. The morning's bravado, his corporate triumphs and public vindication, had worn into something more open. "You hurt me," she said. "You made me feel foolish for being honest, for bearing what I believed." Her voice softened. "But I also saw you stand up for the house." There was an inward tug, like someone choosing a corner of a map and circling it. "I tried to protect the only thing that felt less negotiable than my name," he said. "And I did it badly. I have no defense other than to ask you if you can forgive me." Forgiveness, she knew, was not a switch. She took time. But in the weeks that followed, she began to allow small things. A coffee shared, a walk where they spoke about unthreatening things, the texture of the city's winter, Teo's new obsession with outer space. Conversations opened like doors left ajar. Murilo learned, slowly and often with difficulty, how to be held accountable in a way that was not about image. He apologized publicly for the deception in a quiet statement that accepted responsibility without grandstanding. He apologized to Lydia in ways that were specific and not performative. He returned an old card she had once left in his drawer and read aloud from the list of things she had written that made room for light in the house. He told her he understood why she had felt violated and promised, clumsily but sincerely, to never again hide behind a silence he could have shared. Their reconciliation was not cinematic in the immediate sense. There were arguments, there were retreats and tests. There were evenings when the weight of his past choices pressed between them like a cold draft. But there were also dinners cooked together, her leading, him learning, long drives to pick up school supplies, and hours when Murilo put his phone in another room because she had asked him to be present. He learned how to keep one of his most important spreadsheets closed. The parents, too, were in a process of mending, though those stitches were slower, made of small gestures. His father sitting through a cartoon with Teo without an eye roll, his mother bringing an old soup recipe to the kitchen, and insisting Murilo taste it the way he might have in childhood. The household adapted, not into flawless harmony, but into a family that bore the marks of repair like medals, rather than scars. Raphael's exit from the executive role did not erase the ache he had caused. He took a severance and, eventually, a job in another city that let him keep a reputation in certain circles. He called once, a flat apology that read as necessity. The call ended with silence and no repair. For Murilo, the absence was a relief and a sadness. Family does not always have the tidy arcs of reconciliation. Sometimes it simply recedes. Life returned to a quieter cadence. The notepads remained a ritual. Lydia's pencil scribbled notes for Teo's lunches and lists of banal things she refused to forget. Murilo kept the drawer with her cards, but now he kept them as treasured artifacts rather than contraband evidence. He would sometimes take them out late at night and read them, the words of a woman who had refused to tame herself for his convenience. He learned to answer with words that matched what he felt. Months later, one warm afternoon, Lydia came to him with a hand on her belly and a smile that carried a private, growing light. The season was soft. The child played near their feet with a wooden train, unaware of the significance of adult plans. She had a book of baby names open on her lap, tabs sticking out like little flags. Murilo looked at her and felt the ledger inside him open to a column headed, Future. "Are you sure?" he asked, gentling the question as if it were glass. She laughed, an easy, incredulous sound, and leaned into him. "You could have asked me that 3 months ago, and I would have said, 'What are you talking about?' But now? Yes, I'm sure." They told Teo the news later that day with a small ritual. The child was allowed to poke at a printed ultrasound photo as if it were a treasure map. His fingers traced the outline, and then he looked up and decided, with the unwavering logic of a child, that the baby would be an excellent person to teach about dinosaurs. Lydia and Murilo watched him and felt the shape of their future change into something less solitary. There were other outward signs that life was changing. The days of guarded meetings became rarer. Murilo took phone calls in the kitchen, real conversations about banal things like where to buy the best tomato, and sometimes Lydia corrected him about using a too formal word. And he would laugh and say, "Right, don't make me sound like a board minutes page." She left a note on the refrigerator one morning that said, "Please remember to kiss me today." And he did, mid-affair of papers, and meant it. One afternoon, in a small domestic scene that felt like a reconciliation enshrined in the ordinary, Murilo and Lydia sat on the floor with Teo and a labyrinth of blocks. The living room smelled of lemon and the last of the day's sunlight. Lydia had flour on her fingers and a Band-Aid on her thumb. Murilo had a smudge of crayon on his cuff. They were not picture perfect, and they did not need to be. They were, in the rough-hearted way of people who had hurt and been hurt, learning to stitch themselves into something durable. His parents came by often now, bringing arguments about the merits of a certain chair or gossip about a neighbor. Their presence was sometimes noisy and always human. Maria kept the schedule in the house like a compass, and the staff laughed more often in the kitchen. The house was messy in the most important ways. Dishes left overnight, toys underfoot, a basil plant that refused to grow but kept trying. Raphael's name faded into background noise. It remained sometimes as the subject of an old bruise, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of days. The most potent thing that had been exposed that winter was not simply the brothers' greed. It was the difficulty of being human, incomplete, capable of cruelty, and also capable of changing. In a quiet moment months later, Murilo sat at his desk with a small stack of notepads. Lydia's handwriting peeked from a folded corner. There were cards that said things like, "You snore just enough to be lovable," and "Buy milk." Also, "Buy courage." He held one up to the light and traced the loop of a letter with a thumb. He thought back to the sequence that had begun with an accident, then with a lie, and then rippled into truths he had never expected to meet in the open. He had heard what he shouldn't. He had listened and, in listening, acted in a way that had saved people and exposed a betrayal. He had also erred, chosen a path that wounded someone he cared for. The calculus of that mistake had been messy and real, but the final line, the one that mattered in a house filled with toys and arguments and soup, was simpler than any boardroom decision. He dialed Lydia's number, and while the call connected, he left his desk and walked into the living room. She looked up from where she was reading, the child asleep on her lap. He knelt, careful not to wake the child, and took her hand. "I heard you," he said. "I heard everything I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry for how I used that hearing. I heard your fears, your jokes, your whole messy self, and I chose to stay." Her eyes were wet with something temperate and true. She squeezed his hand back like an answer, not a concession, and leaned her head against him. Outside, the city made its frequent noise. Inside, the house kept its ordinary, imperfect music. A toy car skittering, someone humming in the kitchen, the soft breath of sleep. Murilo, who had once controlled silence like a ledger, let the noise be the household's measure rather than his. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony that favored neighbors over networks, with Lydia's friends from her old job, and some staff members who had watched the household's secret weather. His parents stood beside them, less like judges and more like two people who had learned too late lessons about pride. Raphael did not attend. He sent a formal note that read like a man trying to practice civility, and then went his separate way. At the reception, Teo danced like a monarch with a sock puppet as his scepter. Lydia's laughter filled the room. Murilo caught her hand and pulled her in close, whispering something private and ridiculous that made her snort. They both laughed, and then fell silent in that comfortable way that exists between people who have seen one another's worst, and decided, despite it all, to stay. Years later, in a living room battered by toys and good arguments, Murilo found one of Lydia's old cards tucked into a cookbook. It had the familiar wry line, "You're no mustache away from being a romantic cliché." He read it, and in the margin she had once left a note in pencil, the words faded but legible. "If you wake up from this act, don't make me regret loving you." He had not made her regret it. He had listened, clumsily and then with effort, and had chosen to answer. He had heard what he shouldn't, and in choosing to stay, he had found a different kind of kingdom, a household that did not belong to the ledger, but to the people who lived in it. The fortune that had once been his measure now had a different value. The laughter of a child, the way Lydia's hand fit in his, the sight of a small heartbeat on an ultrasound that meant a tiny, ordinary person would one day argue about who made the best pancakes. If this story touched you, like and share, and tell us in the comments where you'd run if someone you admired whispered a secret you weren't supposed to hear.